Hello my sea olives, Seabro here, and in this video we'll look at the matchups of the dive composition against dive, spam and brawl. This is the last of 3 videos looking at compositional matchups in Overwatch. We will get into some of the less abstract and more fun content soon, but for now let's dive straight into some juicy content. Okie dokie, so we have talked about the spam matchup, we have talked about the brawl matchup, now let's talk about dive. Before we do, I will reintroduce us to this friendly little graph here. My apologies if you have just come from the last 2 videos and you have seen this twice before, but this graph is really important so I will say it again. This graph shows how effective each team composition are at different stages of a fight. As you can see, Brawl start off really strong but slowly get less effective over time, spam compositions are very consistent, and importantly for this video, dive has this spike in the middle where they are really effective, but everywhere else they are pretty weak. It's this power spike where you want to win the fight. This composition needs to avoid losing the fight before this spike happens, and then they need to be explosive enough to finish the fight off before they become less effective. I'll also add for this video, because I'm focusing on dive, that this peak here can change its properties based on the composition you are running. The more sustain you have in your dive composition, the wider the peak in the graph. But typically the less sustain you have, the more explosive you are and the higher the peak. A good example is having an Ana. That gives you more sustain, your team can stay in the fight for longer, so the bump on the graph will last for longer. Whereas if you replace that Ana with a Zenyatta, then we can explode targets a lot quicker, but we have much less sustain. So the graph's peak will be higher, but it will last less time. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyways, now that we've got that out of the way, let's look at our first matchup. Okay, so let's start with dive versus dive. This is a bit of a messy matchup because neither team has much spam, so both compositions are free to try and take areas of the map and try to surround the enemy. But both teams play split and are free to roam the map, and you end up with everyone playing separately and taking duels with each other separately until either team is ready to jump in and initiate a dive. But when one team decides that they can successfully initiate a dive, all of their heroes jump on the enemy, and the enemy team will initiate what is called a counter dive. Effectively, they'll dive the enemy dive. They'll kill for their team. There are advantages to being the proactive team, but also to being the reactive team. If you are the proactive team, i.e. you initiate first, you can decide when and where to dive, and your backline are unlikely to have any pressure on them. But on the other hand, if you're playing a Winston and you react to the enemy dive, you counter dive, then you can block the enemy hills and mount down the enemy tanks. In general, you have sustain based dive compositions which want to engage and sustain a fight, and then you have explosive dive compositions where you want to get in and get a kill immediately. So, for example, Winston Ana has a lot of sustain, but Brawl Zen would have next to no sustain at all. If you are playing an explosive dive composition like Brawl Zen, then you don't really care about the enemy blocking off your heals. In fact, you might be able to get a kill and get out before the enemy team can even counter dive. So in this case, you always want to be proactive. It doesn't matter if you don't get the perfect setup, you just want to act as quickly as possible and then get out pretty quickly. Similarly, if you are a sustain heavy dive composition playing against an explosive dive composition, then you want to be proactive as well in order to stop the enemy team from being proactive. It's not always the case that you want to play proactively though. If both teams are playing a sustain heavy dive composition with a Winston as their main tank, then by counter diving you can block the enemy heals, giving them much less sustain and giving you the advantage. Because your healers can still heal each other, whereas an Ana, for example, on the other side of the map won't be able to heal through the Winston bubble. In this case, the counter diving team actually has the advantage, and you can only actually look to be proactive with an ultimate like Primal or Nano. In this case, you still end up playing proactively though, but off ultimate cycles. The most common cycle is Primal or Nano, and they work great because they help build up the other one, but pretty much any ultimate can be used as a reason to engage. If you are one of those teams with a Genji one trick who tried to force him into every composition, then feel free to Primal one fight, then Nano Blade the next. Hopefully that makes sense. In case it doesn't, let's look at an example. Here we are on Ilias Well, and Outlaws are playing against Justice. Both teams are running the same composition, other than the D.Va and Zarya pick. Whilst having the Zarya makes it more of an explosive composition, neither team want to hard engage the other because they don't have ultimates, so you see a lot of soft dives whilst they are trying to build up nano. But in fact it's Mag on the Winston that overcommits onto the Zarya, and because modern day dive compositions are just too good at peeling for their team, without the nano or primal, it would have been better to not force an engagement. In this case, Washington want to wait and play aggressively off ultimate cycles. Let's stay on Ilios well for the next example. This is a game between Dynasty and Valiant, and both teams are running Brawl. Obviously they both have a pharmacy, but both their playstyles are aggressive and neither team is trying to play a spam playstyle, so it works for this example. Here both teams run out of their spawn and try to keep the distance. Neither team want to get jumped and play a peeling game, and when both teams do decide to dive, it's not perfect. They haven't waited for the perfect opportunity to get ultimates online or spot someone out of position, they just do it as quickly as possible. Here the Dynasty's composition is playing split. You have the D.Va who is responsible for peeling for Ana, and the Pharmacy and Brawl try to explode on top of the enemy Ana. And yes, this wasn't an optimal Brawl performance by Silver 3 in any way, shape or form, but again he's trying to force the fight at the earliest opportunity before Gesture can engage. It's really important when playing this dive versus dive matchup that you think about whether or not you want to be playing this counter dive style and only be proactive with ultimates, or whether you want to play this explosive just run out and dive them ASAP style. It's also worth noting that this matchup is chaotic in nature. It always will be. When there is a Brawl or spam based team, everyone sticks together or you play split in these neat little groups. Dive versus dive, a lot of the time it's just everyone playing separately towards a common goal. So it's important that you talk about what splits you want to play and when beforehand. In this second example, just a second ago, we saw that the D.Va peeled for the Ana whilst the rest of the team went in. It's important that you discuss ahead of time whether you want to play with all 6 people diving or counter diving, or whether you want part of your team to peel and part of your team to dive. The advantage of each can get a bit complicated, but just make sure that you are all on the same wavelength before the game starts. I just want to summarise this section so we're all on the same wavelength. Dive vs Dive is much more about micro plays from all members of your team than any other composition. But when you dive, timing is key to make your composition as explosive as possible. You have to make a decision whether or not the explosiveness of your composition trumps the peeling capabilities of the enemy's composition. If it does, then you want to engage as proactively and early as possible. If not, then you want to play slow until you get ultimates up and then play proactively off your ultimate cycles. Hopefully we are all fine with dive versus dive now. I know that was long, so let's look at dive versus Brawl. When attacking with dive against Brawl, you often need to use ultimates to engage. This gives you the explosiveness you need against Brawl. In the same way that I talked about considering how explosive you are compared to how good the enemy is at peeling when I was talking about dive versus dive, Brawl are great at peeling and it has a lot of sustain, so you often need to go through the ultimate cycle route. Obviously if they are out of position or have done something really stupid, then jump them, but the most reliable way to win this matchup is through ultimates. Alternatively, when attacking with dive, you actually have the option to just force points. Often the objective is an open area, right? So Brawl will play somewhere close by, and by getting your tanks to pressure point, it forces them into becoming the attacking team, losing all of the defender's advantage they have, and often walking straight into an open area. Because Brawl compositions have very little to no map control, often you will want to surround the enemy, take high grounds, and all that stuff, because you can take them literally for free, and it will split the enemy's attention. Often forcing the objective has this covered. Most maps have some high ground next to point that you can wait and engage with. If you are defending as dive, then you can surround the enemy for free. You want to look for an engage as the enemy Brawl team is rotating through an open area. Brawl teams are weak during rotations, like mega weak, because they often don't have a cover and they have often used or are using cooldowns, which makes it very effective to engage in mid-rotation. But I do want to say that the longer the fight drags on, the more the Brawl composition is at an advantage. So if the fight is prolonged, even if you have a pick, you want to disengage and jump out and then jump them again with full resources. The last thing you want to do is get a pick but then overstay your welcome and end up at the later stages of the graph and just die to the Brawl composition. Let's look at an example. Let's say we are playing dive on Anubis, defense on point B, and a Brawl composition are attacking. It's fairly common for them to attack through here. We have two options. We can either jump them mid-rotation here, and this will allow us to dive the middle of their team, separate the front line and the back line, and explode all over their squishies. The other option would be to force them to meet us on point. We could contest point and force them to push into the open area and then jump them. Which option you go with is fairly dependent on how explosive your composition is and the enemy team's composition. It's fairly similar to the dive versus dive matchup, where the first option is to proactively dive them during rotation, and the second option is the reactive option to dive them on point. Another really important aspect of this matchup is how long we stay in as dive. If we look at our handy graph, we can see that after our initial spike, Brawl have the advantage. If you watched my previous video on Brawl composition matchups, then you will have heard me say that Brawl are looking to survive the dive and win the fight by out-sustaining dive. Because of this, whether you get a pick or not, you want to get out pretty quickly after diving and then look to dive again. It's often a mistake lots and lots of lower level teams make, where they assume that because they have got a pick, then they need to just press W and rush in with dive, and this really isn't the case. With this matchup, you want to be playing in spurts and to try and keep all engagements in your optimal zone. So in conclusion, playing dive against Brawl is about punishing mid-rotations and forcing point. You want to play in spurts of aggression. You don't want to try and out-sustain Brawl because you can't. You can surround the enemy really easily because the enemy doesn't have much poke potential, so unlike dive versus dive, you don't really have to rush your engagement. Take your time. As with any dive matchup, individual mechanics and timing are also key. Anyways, let's talk about dive versus spam. Dive versus spam. Dive versus spam is all about playing angles and minimizing the spam you take before you get a dive opportunity. When attacking dive, you want to play as separate units and try to surround the enemy before then jumping them. For example, if you were playing Winston, D.Va, Tracer, Sombra, Ana, Brig, then Brig, Ana might play together. Winston, D.Va might play together sometimes. Tracer might play alone, and same with Sombra. So you would have 4 different units or splits that are trying to find different angles on the enemy. The key to a successful dive is making sure that you don't get spammed out before you jump the enemy. If even one of your units gets pressured out, then your dive is unlikely to have the explosiveness it needs to get a kill. Like I said in my dive video, all of these units need to get to the enemy at the same time in order to get the most value out of your composition. And you need to all attack the same character, preferably the quickest one to kill on the enemy team. A similar problem occurs when the opponent mirrors your splits. If you don't engage with at least most of your team, then you're going to struggle to get a kill. I think this matchup is best seen through examples. This is a game between Dragons and NYXL on Havana. Dragons are attacking with an incredibly aggressive dive composition, and whilst NYXL have some very similar heroes, the Orisa and Widowmaker mean that they want to be playing much slower and spam orientated than Dragons. When attacking with dive, you need to take angles on the enemy. When the cart is here, usually the angles are here, here, and either here or here. So you will get 3 angles on the enemy, and then you will explode onto them. In this example though, the Dragon's Sombra gets contested by the Tracer and the Hammond decides to contest the Widowmaker, leaving the core of their team to try and explode onto a fortified Orisa, and here the Dragons haven't got the useful angles that they need on the enemy. Here it would have almost definitely been better to ignore the Widowmaker, if she stays there at least, and then set up the Tracer on this aggressive angle, and then get a pile driver off from main. The point I want to make here is to show you that not only do you all need to take angles, you need to make sure that by the time your team wants to hard dive, that all those angles are actually effectively dealing with the dive target, or you won't be able to explode into the enemy. I also want to quickly show an example of what I mean by avoiding spam, because a lot of players have ingrained in them some sort of belief that you need to be doing something, shooting something or moving towards something at all times. This is a game on Rialto between Dynasty and Spark. Spark are playing an extremely aggressive explosive composition. Zen Brig Heals gives them next to no sustain at all, and they're going to be looking to dive on a hacked target and to be in and out quickly. On the other hand, Dynasty are playing a spam composition. When they come out of the gates, they realise what the enemy's running, so they switch to an anti-dive comp, but they still have spam potential, so it's still interesting to see. So let's see what happens. Other than Shy on Sombra getting a tiny bit of ult charge, everyone remains hidden. Their comp doesn't poke or spam at all. This is really important. If they take damage or have to use cooldowns, then their dive will be ruined. So this is what I mean by don't take any spam. The ideal situation is when the enemy has no idea where you are and you have all of your cooldowns ready for a dive. So when I say avoid spam, I mean avoid spam. But anyway, that is it for this video. I really hope you have learned something and enjoyed this video in some sort of way. If you have, remember there is a like button. But have a fabulous weekend and I'll see you all in the next video. Ka-ciao!